الورقة الأولى للدكتور ديفيد بيلي تتعلق باستراتيجيات الصناعية وعلاقتها بالتنمية، فليتفضل. ولكل متحدث سوف أعطي 20 دقيقة ومن ثم ننتقل إلى باب النقاش. دكتور ديفيد.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the organisers of this really interesting event, and congratulations to the Emirates Centre for 25 very successful years. Here's to the next 25. It's a great pleasure to be here. What I'd like to talk today is about industrial policy and competitiveness in the context of Industry 4.0. We had some brilliant sessions yesterday, modern technology and the future of energy, for example, and also on security, where many of these technologies were being mentioned. And I'll pick up on some of the discussions yesterday. I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by Industry 4.0. It will be familiar to many of you. I'll talk about a project in which I've been involved, funded by the European Commission, called Makers, which is trying to give a broader impression or interpretation of Industry 4.0, so that it's not just about a particular set of technologies being developed, but how they may have a more general influence on the economy and how many different sectors will be affected. So these technologies will have what economists term a kind of general purpose technology feel. They will transform many different sectors. And I'd like to give you an example of the automotive case. We were hearing yesterday about how the automotive industry will transition towards electric vehicles. And while I agreed with everything that was said yesterday, I actually think in many parts of the world it will be much quicker than was being discussed yesterday, particularly in Europe and in also China. And then I'd like to finish by focusing very much on implications for industrial policy and competitiveness of this industrial revolution that we are going through. If we look back on history since the 19th century, we've had these waves of technological change. They're called Kondratiev long waves. So as well as the usual ups and downs of the economic cycle, we've had these significant clusters of innovation which have then had a profound impact on the broader economy. If we think of the first industrial revolution in the 1800s, steam, cotton, iron, transforming the economy in many ways, leading to the creation of the first factories, but also the first firms as we understand it as an economic organisation. Later on, waves of technological change associated with railways, iron, steel, then electricity, chemicals, automotives, electronics. We're now entering a new wave around Industry 4.0. Whenever I put that diagram up, economists argue about how many waves we've had. So let's just agree that waves take place. But if we think of the first industrial revolution, which began in the UK and Northern Europe, where we had new technologies leading to small-scale, standardized production. The second industrial revolution, Fordism, large-scale, standardized production. The third industrial revolution was what was termed flexible specialization, particularly in northern Italy. Small-scale, but more customized production. The fourth industrial revolution will be large-scale, but customized production, so whereby big-scale production, but consumers able to co-create products with manufacturers. I'll come back to that in more detail. So what we're seeing is a range of different technologies. Information and communications technology, 3D printing, there's an example out in the foyer, artificial intelligence, robotics, sensoring, space technologies, brilliant presentation we were just hearing about, I really enjoyed it, and things like drones. They will change the nature of the production process. So we see smart, connected factories producing things just as they are needed, and mass customization, whereby consumers design products which are then built at low cost. But in addition, there are also technologies linked to this around biotechnology, green and renewables, which could reconcile economic growth with sustainable long-term development. Of course, there is a discussion about whether this is a revolution or an evolution of existing technologies combining together, but it's a very hot topic amongst both academic researchers and also policy makers, this fourth industrial revolution. Now, in the European Union, the definition of Industry 4.0 is very engineering-based. It comes from a German definition of the new technologies that are coming, and is largely around Germany's ambition to reposition its manufacturing base with the technologies that are coming. So it's looking at how technology and devices autonomously communicate with each other along the value chain. So it's about how we could have smart and linked factories, mass customization, reduction in stocks and costs, and cyber physical systems. That is happening. We are having this engineering and production revolution that is taking place. But the Makers project that we're involved in is saying actually Industry 4.0 will have a much broader impact on the economy and society as those technologies are used in lots of different ways. So not only can we think about the new technologies, many of which we heard about yesterday, but whole new markets will be created. I'll talk in a moment about one particular case in terms of the automotive industry and personal mobility. But if we think about how Industry 4.0 will work in that sector, already the car that I drive is electric. I can control many of its features from my smartphone. I can turn it on, I can turn it off if it gets stolen. Don't need insurance so much. If the car is 100 meters away, I can summon the car to come and pick me up. It's always connected to the internet. Increasingly, the car will drive itself. So increasingly, the car will be autonomous. On highways, it largely drives itself. So in the future, the way this Internet of Things plays out in the car industry is we're likely to see a shift, as we heard yesterday, from the internal combustion engine towards autonomous, driverless, connected electric vehicles. In the future, beginning in the mid-2020s, and more prevalent in the 2030s, we will see driverless taxis in many of our big cities. I already saw them being tested in Singapore, for example, 2 years ago. So in big cities in the 2030s, we won't need to own cars anymore. We will summon a driverless taxi. So increasingly, we will consume a mobility service, and car companies will have to think about what they are offering. Are they making something, or do they have to position themselves in a new ecosystem? So whole new markets will be created. Also, consumers increasingly will co-create the products that they consume. So to give you an example from the city I live in, Birmingham, there's a traditional jewellery manufacturing cluster that's been there for over 200 years. Today, I can go on the internet, I can design a piece of jewellery, either myself or with a designer, and that jewellery is printed out for me using 3D technology. They'll probably print out two so that I can keep one in a safe. I don't need an insurance policy. We can see similar applications in furniture, in items around your home, and in lots of other applications. So the consumer increasingly will co-create products. Come back to that later in the form of markets, which Christos Patelis has led the way in understanding. We will have new business models. Increasingly, companies that make things don't sell you a product, they provide you with a service. That will be car companies in the future. So for example, in Europe, BMW already has 5 million customers who don't buy BMW cars, they pay a monthly subscription for a mobility service. They can pick up a car and drop off a car around cities easily and pay by the hour to use a car. So already the mobility model is shifting towards a service. Famously, Rolls-Royce aero engines don't sell aero engines. They provide power by the hour. Lift companies offer vertical movements. Photocopying companies offer a photocopying service, and so on. So increasingly, it's about manufacturing and services being provided together. So manufacturers will offer a range of things, of which manufacturing is one thing. Increasingly, there will be an emphasis on sustainability. If we think about the nature of 3D printing, It's about adding a material to build a product up rather than starting off with a giant piece of metal and then taking pieces off. We can be much more sustainable. And as things become much more automated, we may need much less labour to make things. Huge issue, by the way, in terms of jobs being destroyed and also created. But it also means that labour costs are much less important, and there is the scope for much more localised supply chains or value chains. So Europe, for example, is seeing manufacturing jobs returning to Europe, even though it's high cost, jobs which had previously gone to Southeast Asia, for example. That's linked to the fact that labour costs are no longer so significant. It's linked to issues of, say, quality in products coming from China. But it's also linked to the fact that demand is changing. So often, manufacturers want to be close to their end market to respond very quickly to changes in consumer taste. Linking all that together, we may see new production spaces being created. I've already discussed that, so I'll move on. Now, in international business, one of the things that is sometimes used in terms of understanding this is what's called the global value chain. So the diagram on the left-hand side shows the degree of value added on the vertical axis and elements of the value chain on the bottom. So if we think about research and development, design being high value, branding and marketing being high value. That's what Apple does, for example. They do the research, the development, the design, the branding. The assembly was contracted out to somebody else in China. In the future, assembly may have higher value if consumers co-create products and they can be printed out at much lower cost using 3D printing. So the nature of that value chain may change. In other words, we are going to see whole new value chains in the future. So both companies, but also countries, in thinking about where they're looking to specialise, need to think about how value chains will change in the fourth industrial revolution. And we will see a whole range of new production models, the provision of service, co-innovation between consumers and producers, customisation on a mass scale whereby consumers can create products which are then produced. The need for much more technology content in products as well, linked to this Internet of Things. Now, if we think about the automotive industry as an example, then engineers, consultants emphasize the technology side of the developments that are coming. So we can think about artificial intelligence, sensors in cars, the communication between cars that are autonomous and other cars and the road infrastructure. The need for factories in the future to be much more flexible to produce in response to individualized customer demand. That's all happening. But we also need to think about the whole range of other technological changes that are happened much more holistically. So we know that autonomous driving is coming, autonomous driverless cars. Cars are increasingly connected to the internet. They will have to talk to other cars and the infrastructure around us. Increasingly in big cities, there is a shift towards car sharing. Younger people in the US and the UK increasingly don't even have driving license. They will use an Uber taxi in cities. They don't want to waste money on owning a car that depreciates in value and sits empty for 90% of its time. So there's a shift towards car sharing. And the use of electric mobility and lightweight materials from aerospace. So a whole load of new technologies that are coming and are combining. And by the way, in the UK, we have a particular problem with the uncertainty over Brexit affecting investment in many of those industries. So if we think about the traditional value chain in the car industry, on the left-hand side, you have suppliers, the assemblers, which then control brands and control the distribution and marketing. A very vertical value chain. In the future, we're going to see a much more broad ecosystem of different sectors and technologies linked together. We were hearing about space technology this morning. Satellite technology will be a key part of that in terms of the connectivity and the mapping and the navigation of these autonomous vehicles. The new energy sources which are coming in terms of electric power in particular. The need for ride-hailing services on your smartphone, so you'll be able to summon a car, a driverless car, using your phone, which will pick you up and drop you off. Electric cars are coming in a very big way. From the early to mid-2020s, they will outcompete the internal combustion engine, and we will see a rapid shift over to electric-powered cars, particularly in Europe and China. China was mentioned yesterday. Last year in China, 1 million electric cars were sold. This year it will be 1.6 million. The Chinese government has decided it cannot compete in the internal combustion engine and is aiming to go virtually completely electric, not only to create a whole new industry and value chain, but also to solve problems of poor air quality in their cities. And also we even see 3D printing of components going into cars, both to replace parts that are worn out, but also there are even car companies now whereby the consumer designs a car and a car manufacturer prints it out for them. So a co-creation process. So if we think about the future automotive value chain, just to give you a flavour of some of the changes that are coming, we will shift towards fleets of driverless taxis, which we summon on demand, and we choose a type of vehicle that we want. What does that mean for this sector, this industry? There will still be vehicle designers and manufacturers making cars. They could be existing car companies or new firms entering the market. Firms will provide an operating platform so that the fleets can work. That's likely to be new technology providers. Other firms will provide a user experience platform, controlling the experience that the passenger has within the cabin. Companies will provide data services, entertainment, traffic, mapping, weather. Other firms will create fleets of cars. Think about the airline industry today. If you fly in a flight with, say, British Airways from London to Singapore, the flight may or may not be operated by British Airways. It may or may not own the plane. It may be leasing it from a fleet operator. Companies will create fleets of driverless cars. Other firms will operate the fleets. That could be an existing car company, or it could be an Uber or a new entrant. You might also have apps on your phone that join up your travel. So you may say, okay, I'm going from Birmingham, the city where I live, to Edinburgh. I choose a travel app which then books a ticket using a driverless taxi, a train, public transport, all in one go. So it integrates your journey. And then you've got others that may service and maintain the fleets. Existing companies have to position themselves in a very different ecosystem. So the key issues from this are increasingly we're going to move to a world where consumers co-create products with manufacturers. There will be new ways of consuming, using and accessing services. Increasingly, manufacturers will provide services as well as a manufactured product. There is a big issue about economies of scale. If we shift to a model whereby increasingly we use 3D printing and other new technologies, it may be possible to have efficiency at very low levels of production. We may see shorter value chains closer to the end market, and we will need to rethink products and processes from a much more ecological perspective. Big differuences across Europe in terms of how far countries are going, in terms of adapting and anticipating to Industry 4.0, front runners like Germany and the Scandinavian countries, other countries further behind. And companies need to be aware of the changes that are coming, understand how they may apply them, adopt and achieve some sort of competitive advantage. However, there are huge barriers to this. Increasingly, it's clear that companies may be unaware of the scale of changes that are coming. There may be resistance to change in terms of existing business models that firms don't want to move away from, a large degree of risk and uncertainty. Now, under those conditions, then there's a role for industrial policy both to speed things up, reduce uncertainty, and enable a transition more quickly than would be the case by simply relying on the market. So, in terms of our implications for industrial policy, we need to understand the scale of change that is coming, and we need to make sure that all parts of the economy are aware of this fourth industrial revolution. There needs to be a clear, committed direction of travel which provides certainty to companies and the economy. There's a need to join up the new technologies that are coming with different sectors in different places. And that calls for the need for a regional-based industrial policy. I'll come back to that very quickly in the context of the UAE in a moment. As new technologies are developed, particularly as we see much more widespread application of automation, there's going to be a need for skills training and retraining. We heard yesterday in the context of security how perhaps education is going to be the most important element of security in the future. I would echo that. But it's an emphasis, I think, on skills and education throughout our lives. So as jobs are destroyed and new ones created, people will need to be trained and retrained continually throughout their lives. Some countries do this very well, the Scandinavian countries and Singapore. Other countries less so. So it's a commitment to lifelong skilling and training. Infrastructure will need to improve dramatically. Charging infrastructure for cars, for example, or 5G technology. Firms will need access to the new technology through access to finance, funding and support. There may be a role for governments to provide platform sharing technologies that could be available to be used in lots of different industries. And there may be increasingly a need for open innovation approaches across firms. So instead of looking to innovate internally, companies increasingly will have to look outside for ideas. How do we enable that as part of our industrial policy? The other point is that, as we saw with the auto industry, value chains will change dramatically. So companies and sectors will need to think not only about how they reposition themselves on existing value chains, but what are the new value chains that are going to be created in the future? Where might we specialize to achieve competitive advantage? And I think one of the things here is that modern forms of industrial policy, as we'll hear in a moment from Dominique Foray, is a process of discovery of tacit knowledge. It's about identifying opportunities, challenges, and how to overcome them. And I think that is one of my key messages for the Emirates, in that there are many interesting aspects of industrial policy being developed. They could benefit by being better joined up and having a process of ongoing discovery of opportunities and challenges. I'll skip over these. Now, on the beginning, you probably saw this little rubber duck in the slide at the beginning. My son likes rubber ducks in his bath. This actually is a 3D printed rubber duck. I was at a conference in Switzerland last year, and in the foyer of the hotel, just like here, there was a 3D printer. You could design the rubber duck that you wanted, pay €3, and it would be printed out for you. You might say, well, okay, that's the fourth industrial revolution producing complete rubbish. What's the point? The point was, I paid €3, that went to a charity that funded the printing of prosthetics, custom-made prosthetics for children without limbs. A completely new market, something that we'd never done before, customized limbs for children who were missing limbs. So that the new technology could be used in a way to enhance people's lives in a way that we've never done before. So we've seen already in the United Arab Emirates great progress, a great track record on innovation. We've seen the strategy for the future and the strategy for the fourth industrial revolution. So already there is thinking about how Industry 4.0 could impact on different sectors in the country and how the country is anticipating and responding to this. Going forward, there's a need for a recognition of what challenges could slow that down, what long-term innovations might unlock efficiency, cost reduction and revenue gain, and broader implications for society. And I think the various initiatives that we've seen would benefit by being joined up into an overall holistic industrial policy. Research has shown big barriers to unlocking Industry 4.0. So uncertainty, the high financial cost, the slow expansion of basic infrastructure. This is from European countries. Going forwards, companies and sectors need to think about what their Industry 4.0 strategy is, creating pilot projects, transforming often companies into digital enterprises which also offer a service, and position them within a broader ecosystem. That, I think, calls for a more broad-based industrial policy to make that happen quickly. Thank you very much.